In English, probably difficulty of living or finding it hard to live. I think actually ikizurasa is a term you hear often if you visit Japan like now. Ikizurasa, it's tough to live. 2 years ago, I was in Hiroshima right after a conference, and at the bookstore, there was an entire section on ikizurasa.
That is Dr. Chikako Ozawa-de Silva, and this is episode 22 of the Ikigai Podcast. Find your Ikigai at ikigaitribe.com. Content warning: this podcast episode contains information regarding suicide which may be unsettling for some people. For help, please contact your local crisis center. It's Nick Kemp here with episode 22 of the Ikigai Podcast, and in this episode I'm speaking with Dr. Chikako Ozawa-de Silva. Chikako is an Associate Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Today we will be discussing a lack of Ikigai, loneliness, and relational meaning. Chikako's research focuses on cross-cultural understandings of well-being, especially mental well-being and contemplative practice. Her work brings together Western and Asian perspectives on the mind-body, religion, medicine, and therapy. Chikako is the author of the book Psychotherapy and Religion in Japan, the Japanese Introspection Practice of Naikan. Chikako is also the author of Toward an Anthropology of Loneliness, a special journal article from the Transcultural Psychiatry journal that came out in October of 2020. And this article attracted a great deal of interest due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Her book, The Anatomy of Loneliness, Suicide, Social Connection, and the Search for Relational Meaning in Contemporary Japan, is scheduled to come out in November 2021 from the University of California Press. And Chikako, you have also written many papers on the topic of Naikan, mental health, and today's topic, loneliness. Chikako, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
It's my pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. And I will caution our audience that we are talking about suicide and life meaning. So sensitive but very important topics. So suicide is a very sensitive subject, but it's relevant to how we understand life meaning and Ikigai. And you did a multi-year study of individuals who frequented Japanese suicide websites. So to begin with, Chikako, what attracted you to study suicide website visitors?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it goes back to the year 1998. So I was aware of the sudden rise of suicide by 35% in 1998. And in the end, this rise of suicide, it didn't show any sign of declining until 2010. And another thing I remember was probably that was in 2001 or 2. I was in Chicago and I watched the film Suicide Club at the Chicago Film Festival. So that was featuring on the internet group suicide and the kind of group suicide among young people. So I think that was probably how I kind of took a note. And then it's not very easy to study suicide as anthropologists because we usually rely on interviewing people. So, but in the end, I decided that was a worthy and important topic to study. So that's how I started studying suicide.
Okay, so the increase in suicide in Japan and also this movie was sort of the spark for you to think, as an anthropologist, it's important I study why is there an increase, and you actually wrote an article last year, In the Eyes of Others, Loneliness and Relational Meaning in Life Among Japanese College Students, and we'll be talking about that article in depth. So with these suicide websites, could you provide a history of them? These suicide websites in Japan.
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, that probably was in early 2000s, that a number of so-called suicide websites started popping up in Japan. And these suicide websites were usually organized and run by a moderator with features such as bulletin board service. And nowadays, it's probably better known as discussion forums. These websites often have chat rooms and a site guide and links to other websites, other suicide websites, but also suicide hotline websites and phone numbers for people who would like to get some support. And some moderators were formerly suicidal themselves and used their own experiences as ways to support suicidal, website visitors.
I see. So they're really there to try and help people or support people and provide prevention services or links to support services.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I have been following a number of suicide websites since early 2000. At the beginning, I remember there were maybe less emphasis on suicide prevention per se in explicit way, but these websites were mainly there to comfort and support each other among those who are suicidal. So many said that, when they started visiting suicide websites, they are going through the acute suicidal ideation. And that was when they're spending so many hours surfing a number of suicide websites. But then they naturally stopped visiting these sites when they come out of the suicidal period. So meaning actually when people are feeling suicidal, then they found these websites as a place where they could really share their mental pain with other people who are going through the very similar mental pain. But at the same time, I think the reason the suicide websites also have bad names because they also served as platform for people to meet via these suicide websites, plan their group suicide together and die together.
Which is shocking, really is shocking to think that basically strangers agree to meet to suicide together. And I think last week I forwarded you a Yahoo News article where they found, I think it was 3 high school girls and a 50-year-old man had committed suicide together. And don't know the details, but we could assume maybe they had met via a suicide website. So it's very confronting and very sad to think this is how people end their life. So was this a confronting and emotionally straining article for you to research and write?
I mean, certainly, yes. I would say it was definitely mentally taxing. I would say there was a first phase that I was closely following over 40 suicide websites between 2003 through 2009.
Wow.
And so I wrote several articles on this topic. And I think at the time I nearly abandoned idea of maybe pursuing a book project based on this topic.
Yes.
But, I had some encouragement from my senior colleagues, and they told me, this is actually a very, very important topic worthy of exploring in depth. So after 7 years of just intense visits over the suicide websites, I took some break and I revisited these websites in 2018 until now. Basically, when I was putting together this book, forthcoming book, that's when I actually felt the need to see whether there are some changes on the suicide websites, whether they have been the similar way from the early 2000s. One thing I noticed was actually many suicide websites are closed at this point, and then tweets seem to have become actually the main platform for people to kind of connect.
Oh, sorry, Twitter?
Twitter, yeah.
Oh, really?
People are like, tweeting on, saying like, I'm suicidal, like hashtag, and then other people would connect. So it seems to be that nowadays people are using different platforms, instead of these suicide websites as a mean to connect. Yeah.
Wow. That even sounds more confronting, that someone would just go on Twitter and hashtag something like suicidal, let's connect.
Yeah.
So at the core problem of suicide, there seems to be a strong connection to loneliness, and much of the developed world seems to be experiencing a loneliness epidemic. And as an anthropologist who has studied loneliness in depth, how strongly and in what ways does loneliness impact our well-being?
Yeah, now there is a number of studies, and then it is a well-known fact that the long-term loneliness is associated with reduction in lifespan that is actually similar to that caused by smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
15?
15, yeah.
Wow.
And I think, some study found that the 9 million people in the UK often or always felt lonely. And in the US, I think the 2010 survey found that more than a third of American citizens over the age of 45 feel lonely. So loneliness has been a growing health epidemic. And many of us probably read at some point that in 2018, the UK Prime Minister, Theresa May, said like loneliness is one of the greatest public health challenges of our time, and appointed the country's first ever minister for loneliness. So I think now it's widely recognized as a serious public health threat.
Yes, definitely. And a term related to that, and this is something you wrote, and it jumped out at me in your article, mental languishing.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you define mental languishing, and how is it different to mental illness?
Mental illness is like a medical category, and a mental languishing is it's like that is understood as a deficit in emotional, social, and psychological well-being. So if you're not familiar with emotional, social, and psychological well-being, emotional well-being meaning you're feeling happy, and social well-being is like you feel you're accepted by other people, by your community and society. And society makes sense to you. And psychological well-being is something that you have a positive self-worth about yourself. So mental language is something that is, like deficit of these. And actually it is considered more detrimental and more predictive of future suicide than mental illness. So what it means is that those who are suffering from depression but have meaning in life, good relationships, and so on, may be at lower risk for suicide than those who don't suffer from mental illness, but who are languishing and lack these other factors, such as social support and loneliness.
Yeah, this really made sense to me. It was almost like an epiphany where I thought, wow, we could be mentally sound or mentally stable, but if we have no social connection, if we have loneliness, and we have this sense that we don't have purpose or meaning to our life, it would make our life definitely hard to continue living. So we could be mentally fine and capable, but if we're just languishing, as you define it, in these three areas, people would question, why am I living? I'm not happy. I have no sense of purpose. I don't have any strong, meaningful relationships.
Yeah.
So I think this research you've done really provides important answers to what makes our life worth living. But one misconception I'd like to clear up is that when people think of suicides in Japan, I think they have the impression that it's committed by elderly men who may have retired or they've lost their job and they're suiciding because they can't earn income. But this is a misconception, isn't it?
It's a yes and no, because in terms of the total number, it's primarily impacting men in their 40s to 60s. So as you said, people who lost their jobs and what's not. But what was neglected at the beginning of the sudden suicide rise was the suicide rise among young people. Because among young people, suicide rose by 50%, actually much more stark than others. But in terms of the total numbers, I would say probably, men in their 40s to 60s.
Okay, so that's still a significantly higher group.
Yeah, in the last 20 years or so. But I think, at the beginning, government was only focusing on that age group and the reason of the Japan's economic stagnation and how that, economy, the unemployment has been the leading cause of the suicide rise. What was also important was to notice that, like, when you look at young people, they were also showing the rise in suicide at much higher rates than actually people in their 40s to 60s. Yeah, I think nowadays the government is quite aware of the danger of suicide among young people, but it took a while, I think.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to highlight. There's clearly in the last 10 to 20 years, there's been this devastating increase in young suicide, even in elementary school students.
That's right, yeah.
Which is just, that was shocking to read. And so through your research, you came to realize three distinctive types of mental pain and existential angst expressed by these website visitors. So would you like to touch on those 3 points?
Yeah, there are quite a few, right? I was following these suicide websites and I was reading posted narratives, comments by people who are regular suicide website visitors. But eventually I came to realize, as you said, it seems like three distinctive forms of mental pain. Like one is the severe loneliness. It's like acute sense of loneliness. And the second is the kind of absence of meaning in life. What's the point of keep on living? That sense. And the third form of mental pain that I kept noticing was a feeling of not being needed by anyone. So like I don't matter. I don't mean anything. I am replaceable. I'm not needed. I'm not being needed by anyone. So I remember even like one person posting, like, if somebody said she or he needs me, that would be enough. That would be enough for me to keep on living. But the person,
Wow.
just didn't feel that was there. Yeah.
Well, it certainly highlights what's important to us. It's profoundly how simple it could be to satisfy that, just to say, I need you, to someone.
Yeah.
So I loved your article from the knowledge it gave me, but I did find it almost heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
And you wrote some examples of the very confronting and heartbreaking statements. And there's two I'll quote. Someone wrote, "I am too lonely to die alone." And another visitor wrote, "It could be anyone as long as I have someone to die with." And I think you pointed out how shocking the casual nature that these comments were written. So what were these, apart from these people expressing they want to die, what also are they expressing? Because it sounds like they're too afraid to die alone, and they'd find comfort dying with someone who's a total stranger. So what does that mean?
Yeah. Just that, to clarify, these were statements that were very shunned by so-called, social commentaries or, psychologists at the time. So I remember like reading numerous articles or news articles condemning people who end up leaving these notes, saying that they don't even know what it means to live. People who don't even know the weight and value of life. It's almost like
Mm,
to live or to die, or like just being on the virtual reality. So it's almost like I was really sensing so-called adults were not at all sympathetic to these people who
I
were,
see.
having the mental pain and saying, I'm too lonely to die alone. So that's probably also why I studied this topic, because I didn't read that as something so casual or something that doesn't mean much. But I end up noticing eventually were that people were feeling so lonely, so that they wish to find a way to connect with somebody, with other people, even though that end up taking the form of like internet group suicide. So I actually began to read these statements as their cry for help.
Help.
Yeah, people's wish to find a better way, better life. It may sound very ironic, but it's like to die with other people is at least a happy way to end their life. So at least like they can be kind of, among others when they die. And then many people who had this phrase like, I want to reset a button, meaning as if there is kind of a form of afterlife when people die. So maybe that was a wish for also like thinking for some people who are, experiencing intense loneliness. And here maybe that notion that to die alone, or in Japanese it is called kodokushi, solitary
Mm,
death, that is considered a rather unfortunate way to end one's life in Japan. So, for people who are suicidal, to think, oh, I'm so alone already. To die alone is just,
unthinkable.
it just cannot be worse, unthinkable. So I think, for them, actually, that was still a solution to make their situation better. Yeah, that's kind of how I ended up understanding them.
I see. I mean, it is very confronting, but in a way, it does make sense that at least that last experience
Mhm.
is shared. At least you're sharing it with someone. And yeah, that as you said, this irony to it that
Mhm.
you don't want to be alone, but you don't want to continue living, but you're too afraid to die alone. So you're wanting to share the experience of dying with someone. So it's almost as if you can get through it. And I actually did think about if we would touch on what death means in the context of Japanese culture, and how Japanese culture perhaps looks
Mhm.
at death differently. Maybe they don't feel it's the end. Maybe it is passing into a different world or into the afterlife. Have that for a separate episode because there's so much to talk about.
Yeah. No, it itself is a very huge issue topic. And then, yeah, there are quite a few variations even among suicide website visitors. Just to make it short, some felt there may be kind of the life after death. But other people say, no, no, no. In Buddhism, actually, suicide is a way to go to the, hell realm.
Hell.
Yeah, so don't do that. If you do, I mean, you're now going to have a so-called better next life. But
Hmm.
again, yeah, people have different opinions. There was no consensus among the notion of afterlife.
I see.
Mm.
Yeah, that would be a fascinating discussion. So we should point out that your initial study propelled you to conduct further research and to determine whether these types of mental pain and existential angst were only unique to suicidal young Japanese, or if it was something that just non-suicidal young Japanese were thinking about. And so you did a survey of college students, and you interviewed 24 college students discussing suicide, the meaning of a good death, meaning of life, and Ikigai. So that would have been quite a intensive research to interview 24 college students on these subjects. Were the students comfortable discussing these topics, and did they fully open up to you?
I don't actually remember whether I listed all the 14 questions on the article that you read, but I actually put together like 14 different questions, and then it was a semi-structured interviews. So some questions were only yes and no, and others were intended to allow more lengthy answers if they wish. So I think that because of the way the questions were structured and ordered, maybe. I mean, I was surprised to hear how many students said actually how it was helpful for them to talk about things that matter to them. So I remember especially female students, told me that it felt so good to,すっきりした, like spit it out. And others also said it was 癒される. It was very healing. So that was very interesting. It was almost like they had a way of really engaging with things that they think about a lot in their life and having somebody who can like listen to them. So that was kind of how many interviews did go.
Well, maybe that highlights how important it is for us to talk about these things, and we rarely do. We're talking about the latest TV show or something on social media, these very superficial concepts. So how long was each interview generally? Was it an hour or 2 hours of discussion?
So I, with permission, recorded all the interviews. So the shortest one was probably 40 minutes. And some interviews were almost 2 hours.
Okay.
So there are quite a lot to transcribe. And as I say, some questions were pretty open-ended. So some had very short answers. Others kind of really used that as a way of really deepening their own thinkings on the spot. So it was quite, it's a valuable experience for myself, but it was very, it was touching to hear that people found talking that way was also helpful for themselves.
That's wonderful. For example, these podcasts ends up being really meaningful and wonderful experiences. I have these very interesting conversations with people who've studied and researched subjects. So I think we should encourage people to engage in conversation on meaningful things. And so that's wonderful. You got that feedback that these students felt they had a meaningful experience talking about, I guess, but both somewhat confronting but very meaningful ideas of life meaning. And a word that popped up, or not popped up, that you introduce or you talk about in your article is similar to the word Ikigai, which my audience would be very familiar with. But there's another word related to Ikigai, which is Ikiru Imi. So would you like to explain what Ikiru Imi is and how it's different to Ikigai?
Yeah, Ikiru Imi, that literally translates as meaning in life in English. And it's commonly known and used. Actually, in fact, when I was reading suicide websites for 7 years, suicide website visitors often use the term ikiruimi or imi. What's the meaning in life? What's the point of living? And ikiru imi as a word has the connotation of being a kind of, grand question addressing what might be the most important in life in a somewhat abstract and lofty manner. So it sometimes evokes philosophical, ideological, and ontological questions for many. So many college students often say, woo, ikiru imi, that sounds too lofty. I might not have that one, but I can tell you about my ikigai. So that was probably how these college students often distinguished between ikiru imi as something lofty, as opposed to ikigai as something concrete, something maybe more of the small scale things, and relation oriented.
And just on Ikigai, how would you define it?
I actually, of course, I read scholars of Japan who did extensive studies on Ikigai and how they defined Ikigai. Worth of living, I think it's a very good word because it means more than just kind of goal in life or something. But I also use the word purpose in life because ikiru imi is more like a meaning in life. And ikigai is more like purpose in life or what makes life worthy. That's probably how that's how I defined. And it's like feeling oriented. It's about how people feel about their life. So in some way, it's less cognitive in that way for some people.
Yes, I learned from reading Kami Amiko's book Ikigai Nitsu to Ikigai Kan, so Ikigai feeling or Ikigai perception, and then Shimekan, a sense of purpose. Having purpose does seem to be this core element of Ikigai, but feelings related to what we think is our Ikigai is also very important.
Yeah.
And it's so far from the Western interpretation. It's more about how we feel about our relationships or small things that give us a sense of joy or that we feel is worthwhile.
Yeah, I think, one thing is that when you say ikigai or let's say, this purpose in life, it was interesting. Like people thought ikigai is like, purpose in life, but purpose in life is to be needed by someone, isn't it? There was oftentimes a very intimate connection between what college students felt. Most important thing in life is to have kind of positive relationships or being in good relationship or to be able to help others. Not anything so special, but even an act of listening to their friends they found is enough for their ikigai. Yeah, you're right. It's, small scale, relation oriented, and how they feel about themselves.
Yes, I really felt your article, which I'm going to link to, does provide almost the answer for what Ikigai is, in that it's relationship based. It's this this feeling of being needed, and that as you mentioned, one of your students just said, "Oh, if I can listen to my friend talk about their worries, for me that's a source of Ikigai that gives my life meaning."
Yeah.
And it's not about achievement or success, which we're so fixated on in the West, or I think in the whole world, really. We're focused on achieving our goals and making money and social status. And it's what your research reveals and the research of other people, it's about our relationships, the feeling of being needed and being there for other people. And you asked two particular questions in your interviews, and this is what we've just touched on. You asked, have you ever felt that you are needed, and is such a feeling important for you in your life? And the second question, which is another two-part question, is ikiru imi or ikigai important for you in your life? And do you have ikiru imi or ikigai? And if so, what is it? I guess they were the open questions in your interview.
That's right, yeah.
What did you learn from your interviewees' responses?
Yeah, as I argued in my article, that was probably one of the most striking finding that I had. These two questions, when I was putting them together, were not necessarily in my mind connected or closely related to. I was really coming up with these questions based on suicide website visitors' mental pain, right? Like I am not needed by anyone. And also separately, there is no meaning in life. But what was amazing was how so many people viewed ikiru imi or ikigai and the sense of being needed by others in a really intimately connected way. As I, already shared one person's statement, I still remember him just answering my question, being needed. I mean, that is the meaning in life, isn't it? Like that was just a matter of fact in his eyes. And that was probably the moment, like something kind of lit up in my head. Because when I was a college student, I myself didn't probably view my ikigai as anything remotely close to being needed by anyone. But so many college students responded their sense of ikigai in a very similar manners. So that was probably one most important finding I had.
Just on that, do you think maybe, for example, when you and I went to college or university, this was pre-internet or just when the internet was starting, that perhaps we did have fulfilling relationships and we did have a sense that we were needed. And perhaps the people you interviewed, that they have grown up with the internet. And maybe as a result, there is a lack of intimacy or certainly a lower level of intimacy in their relationships. So perhaps when we were younger, we did have more meaningful relationships. And I do wonder now if college-age students now and in the past 5 to 10 years are lacking that level of intimacy because so much of what they do is on the devices, on mobile devices, on computers. What are your thoughts on that?
That is quite a big question, right? And then I am, of course, afraid of giving an overgeneralizing and then simplifying answer to that. I mean, there's so many different factors. But one thing I certainly, started initially feeling positive about these students' responses. And I was actually almost in awe with all these young 20-something years old. Because nowadays, I think my sense of ikigai is much closer to what they say. It's much more relationally oriented. So I thought, wow, they're so profound. They already figure out what's so important in life. But then I also started noticing this kind of air of anxiety among themselves. It's almost like the fear of not being needed. That is so scary to them. So they might even overemphasize the importance of being needed by someone. And because that's so important, that itself becomes their ikigai or meaning in life. So I think what you're talking about is echoing with my own findings and why that has been the case, right? It's always internet, it's always social media. And I think perhaps there is something to that. This is definitely more of the preliminary insights. It's like some thinkings I have on this question, but when I don't actually even have Facebook, so I'm very low social media person. But when I listen to even my young, nephews and nieces and my students, and how they are almost addicted to their iPhones because everything is there. And what happened is actually what you do on this kind of social media platform is you package yourself and present yourself in a very positive light, because that's all about how you want to be perceived by others. But then that's also what you see about others, because others are probably doing something similar. Then if you are experiencing loneliness and you see other people's Facebook and everybody seems having a great time, wonderful life, and that might make you feel even more desperately lonely. So in that way, social media might have created a certain way of connecting with other people. And just a creative, positive facade might be playing such a big part, because they may appear reality to other people. And when they feel like their life is not going the good way, right way in their mind, they might become even more depressed about where they are, right?
Yes. I'm not trying to present social media in a negative light. I think it offers many ways for us to connect, and I've been able to reconnect with old friends. But there's certainly, as you say, we only present what we want to show. So we celebrate our successes or our good news, and it's reduced to, the engagement is reduced to just people leaving a comment. So you're not having a conversation.
Yeah.
You're not telling the full story. And as you say, you present this best version of yourself that's attractive or interesting or fun or playful. And then, as you say, that can probably make other people feel alienated or isolated, because they think, I'm not having success like you, or I'm not doing these great things you're doing. But it seems like this level of false self that's being misinterpreted by all these other people who then respond in the same way. And it's every photo's almost constructed. And I'm sure there are people who retake their photo until they find a really good photo they can share on social media.
Yeah.
So I'm always cautious what I say, because I do use social media to market what I'm doing, and I'm sharing quotes. Like about 8 months ago, my son, I had shared some photos and videos of my son when he was younger, and he just said, "Can you take them all down?" And I said, "Sure." So even our good intentions to share special moments, for example, of our children, we're not even asking our children permission to do that. So it's sort of a minefield, social media. You've got to be careful what you post, but at the same time, it is a part of our life. And I know for my son, we didn't let him have a phone until he was in high school. And it did alienate him. He was left out of the group when he didn't have a phone. So it is a very difficult to manage as a parent. But I mean, going back to what your interviewee said said in reply or response to your questions, there was this amazing wisdom to some of their answers. And I'll quote a few. So a few were, I think my Ikigai is very important, and the people around me are my Ikigai. I wonder what my Ikigai is, perhaps my family and friends, having someone who is dear to me. Something that is small and trivial might be the most important thing. I do not need anything so special. So I think these comments provide us with this, what it means to young Japanese. And again, we're highlighting family and friends, relationship, and it doesn't have to be something big or grand. But we should point out that college students are engaged in the process of meaning making of their future. And I guess they don't have a lot of life experience. But as you pointed out, even students who didn't feel that they had Ikigai recognized its importance. And there were a few quotes about that too I'd like to share. Someone said, "I'm still in the middle of searching for my Ikiruimi and Ikigai, although I fear that I may never find it in my life." And that's what you said earlier. There is this fear that while I know it's important, maybe I won't find it. How widespread do you think that fear is among young Japanese?
Yeah, I mean, what was fascinating to me was that, when students say, yeah, ikiruimi or ikigai is so important. What's the point of life without that? Right after saying how important they are, they say, well, I don't have one for myself. And it's kind of, optimistic. I mean, I think I'm in the stage, I'm like in the searching for my own, meaning in life and ikigai. So that's good. But others were very anxious, like I may never find one. The interesting thing was actually they're like almost like different camps, but of course one group of students would say something like, like those who say, well, ikigai, I don't have anything special, but I have good friends, I have a good family. That's enough for me. So down to something concrete, and then in a way, they are the one who might not make such a big deal out of ikigai. It's like, mine's small, but that's sufficient. Or like, well, I don't maybe have something that is worthy to be called ikigai, but I have friends, so that's enough. And I actually even met somebody who probably didn't quite make it to the article, but one person responded to me like, I never thought about such a thing like ikigai. And this person, because the interview was for 2 hours, clearly was on the end of having pretty good life. Her own sense of herself and her life was overall positive. So it's almost like if you have it, either it's not a big deal, it's okay to have it, but it's also okay not to have it. Or like this person, I never thought about it. Like I don't need it. Meaning if you're like so having a secure attachment, like, good relationship and what's not, your life is good already. Why bother even thinking about such a thing like ikigai? But the people who are like saying, yeah, it's so important, but I don't have it, I have to find one. So maybe there is a bit of the correlation between the, right, like anxiety of not satisfied with their life at the moment, and then maybe by finding ikigai. So this case, ikigai is almost like something lofty for them. Maybe
Yes.
life would be fixed for them. Yeah.
That is interesting how if we do place perhaps too much emphasis on finding it, it does suggest we're lacking it. And then as you learned, there's this fear that we won't ever find it. And then people who don't really need to discuss it or don't even think about it, probably in a way they already have ikigai because their life is good. They have perhaps meaningful relationships. Another Japanese, not a Japanese researcher, but someone who I interviewed, he talked about the advantage of most Japanese on how they approach ikigai with a casual nature. And they don't make it out to be something bigger than it is. And that was what he was trying to share, that if you can just approach it casually and you don't make it something to be grand or big, then it removes that stress of having to find it. But I do wonder, I believe that we do need some life experience probably for us to work out what's important to us. So I'm wondering is, being in our early 20s, let's say, do we have enough life experience to work out our ikigai is? And I do like to think of ikigai as a spectrum of things, as Ken Mogi, Japan's famous neuroscientist, describes it, rather than it being just one thing we have to find. So, yeah, those two questions. Do you think we need perhaps 30 years, let's say 10 adult years of life experience to understand what Ikigai means and how we can find it?
Um, you know, when anyway, so one time, my PhD advisee started day one working with me, and she made a big deal like, Chikako, I turned 25. As if like she became so old. And I think even when I think about myself, I think when I was 21, I thought I had a pretty good life experience under my belt. And then I suspect it depends on people. Some people are feeling, yeah, I don't have much life experience yet. So that's why Ikigai becomes like anticipation for their life, right? Like, I think when I was in my 20s, Ikigai was more like, I would like to accomplish something in my life. So it's like anticipation of my life. So I think that is probably more common among college students. Just it's more, they could be more future oriented.
Yes.
Yeah, in the future, I'll find something. And then once you are in your 40s, so 50s, let's say you have a spouse, you may have kids, you have a pretty secure job, and then Ikigai might become more like your social role of being good parents or, work. In that way, I think Ikigai is malleable depending on where you are in your life. Probably shifts because I think even mine has changed over time, over years.
Yeah, I think mine has. I mean, I think, yeah, you're right. When you're young, you are forward thinking, you're thinking about your goals. And then in my 40s, you tend to reflect on the past and you still have goals towards the future. But you make meaning of your past and you do discover what's important to you through your life journey. For me, that's definitely friendship and family and having these different types of intimacy with people where you can have intellectual intimacy or creative intimacy. I do have this idea that I guess it just makes sense that as you get older and with life experience, you probably can understand that Ikigai comes in different forms. And I did learn from a leisure researcher and Professor Shintaro Kono that the temporal aspect to Ikigai, that we can even feel Ikigai when we reflect on past memories or experiences. And we have another interesting word, natsukashi, that nostalgia can bring up these positive emotions and we can experience Ikigai in that moment when we're just remembering a past experience. So I think life experience gives us more Ikigai opportunity, I guess. And that when we're younger, we're so focused on the future that maybe Ikigai is elusive because it's something we're probably thinking we're chasing. But as you said, maybe it depends on the individual.
Yeah, I think that's why it was very interesting that so many college students, I had a chance to listen to their life stories, said, being in a relationship or being able to be at service for other people. That's the Ikigai. So that says something.
Pretty profound. Yeah, very wise. So another word that's interesting, I had heard of the word ikizurai, but a word you introduce is ikizurasa.
Yeah, ikizurasa. Yeah.
And what does that mean? Because that was mentioned in your interviews.
In English, probably difficulty of living or finding it hard to live. I think these would capture, what ikizurasa like. I think actually ikizurasa is a really, really commonly, a term you hear often if you visit Japan like now. Ikizurasa, it's tough to live. How do we do? I think 2 years ago, I was in Hiroshima right after a conference and at the bookstore. It's just a small bookstore there. There was an entire like section on Ikizurasa.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Over dozens of books on Ikizurasa. I couldn't help but taking a picture. Oh my gosh. Back in the 90s, Japan went through the Iyashi no jidai, like the era of healing. Everything was healing. Oh, it is so healing. Iyashi. So that was when I was still living in Japan. Yeah, Iyashi healing. And then now, a few decades later, it's like, oh no, Japan moved from the healing society to ikizurasa, difficulty of living society. So, yeah, it's almost like, this is something I need to, of course, think more. But what does it say? If in the 90s, what I often saw in the popular, magazines was iyashi. This is so healing. So people were aware of the need for healing. And then now it's almost like, advanced to the next level. It's ikizurasa.
That's really interesting. You mentioned Iyashi, because that's something I learned from Shintaro Kono, this professor who's an expert in leisure. And he interviewed college students. And one of their most valued experiences was Iyashi. So he mentioned there was Tanoshi, Gambari, Shigeki, and Iyashi. And this idea of Iyashi was comfort among your friends, that you could be comfortable with your friends.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting how it has this other perspective of healing that you've just mentioned.
Yeah. It's Iyashi's healing and comfort. Yeah, it's depending on the scale of that. That's right. Yeah.
So I always find it fascinating. I learned so much from these podcast interviews. So going back to ikizurasa, I mean, is ikizurai, is that a common word too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I remember hearing ikizurai or skyzurai or hard to use. So there was one student who rejected the importance of ikigai, and from what I read in your article, she sounded quite pessimistic. And this is a bit confronting. And she said she was really only living out of obligation to her parents. And the only reason she kept on living was because her parents would be sad if she died. So she had this sense of responsibility to keep living because they had invested so much money in raising her and giving her an education. How did you feel and react when you're having this conversation with this person?
The thing was that she clearly had really good and tight relationship with her family, especially with her parents. So in psychology, people who have a secure attachment are considered right in a good place. And then she had all praises when it comes to talking about her parents. And then she became in a good way emotional when she was talking about how important her parents and family are to her. So her case, it really seems to me that despite having a good family life, outside of her family life, meaning society, has been pretty tough to just keep on going and keep on living. So yeah, you're right. Like that really resonated me as somebody who is finding living in society, Japanese society, has been tough, difficult to get by.
I think that'd be really hard to talk to someone who's saying, yeah, I have a good family, they care about me, and I'm fortunate enough to have an education, but I don't want to live. Did you almost want to stop the conversation and stop recording it and just talk to them and say, "Are you okay? And can I help you?" Or did you feel like doing that?
Well, maybe that's what is difficult with the transcribed text as opposed to how it sounded. So
Okay.
she was actually completely calm and not at all like depressed or something. She was thinking it's a matter of fact, without saying, Japanese society sucks or something. She didn't say such a thing. So I don't want to put words in her mouth.
Okay.
The when affect, that I was getting from her was not negative, so I didn't have reason. And she
Okay.
was just voluntarily speaking and then just sharing her story, with me.
She obviously felt comfortable enough to speak openly, being honest about that. Yeah.
Or you could say, really honest about it, or she felt that's nothing strange about her case. It's almost like, this person's being needed by somebody is the meaning of life, isn't it? It's almost like life is tough, isn't it? Of course. But then at least I've got good parents who love me and I love them.
Okay.
So that's good. That's what I got. Everyday life sucks. But hey, what's unique about that? I think in some way that interview probably, if anything, spoke to me that how so many people having this pervasive ikizurasa. So she was actually just saying,
I see.
it's not easy for me as well.
Okay. So maybe I'm reading too much into it, but this is, I think it highlights two things. Life can be hard. It is sometimes to live life is hard. We have all these challenges, and it does make us question why we put up with life, I guess. But there is plenty of reason to live.
Yeah, you could almost flip the coin, right? Like it's my problem to be this way, or the way she sounded to me was, it's really the society's problem. It's not my fault that, that everyday life as a college student is this way. But I'm lucky. I got cool family. I think you can, pretty much see that as implicit statement towards Japanese society, at least in the eyes of the student. Yeah, because other students saying, if I'm not needed by anyone, then that's pretty bad. That level of anxiety also shows maybe they don't feel safe in a society, in the Japanese society right now. If they don't feel safe, then they might really, really need this kind of human connection even more than when you're feeling safe in your surrounding in society, right? Like if you're feeling safe, you don't need to even emphasize, I really need to be needed by somebody, because it's just granted. You feel like, of course, I'm fine. People like me. I like them. And then society is okay. I think there was probably this underlining pervasive sense of anxiety about their future, but future meaning, right? What their adult life is going to look like in this Japanese society. So, they are profound that knowing the meaning in life is relational, but that also means they are not, in a place where they can be so carefree and not think about these things because,
So, I guess if you're not thinking about it, it would suggest you have that already in your life. And what surprised you was the intensity of needing to be needed.
Yeah.
And it went far beyond what you had expected. So this is really important for us, I guess, this takeaway that being needed makes our life worth living, and it's important. And so being needed is all about having these deep, connected, meaningful relationships. And I made a note of this, that to be needed, I guess we need to be useful. Obviously, we need to do things for others. If we think about that, I don't want to sound like, well, just go out and be useful and you'll be liked by others, because that kind of comes across as self-serving or disingenuous. But obviously, to be needed, we do need to, in some way, serve others or be helpful to others, and perhaps we need to make others feel needed. I haven't really discussed this aspect of Ikigai. It hasn't come up in a big way in other conversations, that the feeling to be needed is vital. I know we've touched on it a lot, but I guess we really need to highlight this, that being needed gives us a sense or the feeling of Ikigai.
Yeah, I think one thing you can say is, when I was talking about this anxiety students seem to have, it's just like being needed. Yeah, by somebody means I matter. I matter to somebody. I'm not just a cog in the machine. I'm not replaceable. Yes. But that means they feel that way, probably, right? So, therefore, their need to be needed by somebody becomes even more important to reduce that kind of anxiety. Yeah.
And do you think this is true for most Japanese? So your research only dealt with college students, but
and suicide website visitors who are also young. So yeah, I would hesitate to say it's the same for most Japanese, meaning it's partially developmental in a sense, as I was saying, once people reach in their 40s, it's just meaning for many people by then they might have a family of their own. They might have secure jobs if they have, then that need to be needed might become much, much less obvious or a little bit less intense, because every day you might feel your kids are constantly calling you for this and that, like you're clearly needed by your family members, by your little kids. At the work, you are given some like responsible tasks, so you might not be feeling like you're not needed. But at the same time, right, like this precarious Japanese economy, that the lifetime employment is no longer given, then we might be talking about something very different. Age doesn't necessarily mean you are this age, so you must have a family, because people who don't marry, the single individuals, are also on the rise, has been rising. So many people who never marry till the end of their life have been on the rise. And then many people who do not have stable jobs have been on the rise.
Yes, and of course there's that other problem in Japan of hikikomori, where some people don't want to engage with society, and maybe they're willing to sacrifice the need to feel needed because they feel so uncomfortable in daily society. They'd rather just stay in their room. And as you know, we're not talking a couple of weeks or months. We're talking years, decades in some cases, where men have spent 10, 20 years of their life where they haven't ventured outside at all. Japan does seem to be having these unique problems. You mentioned kodokushi, dying alone, hikikomori, and now people deciding to try and find someone to die with. I wonder if it's radical change in the last 3 generations, where there's the previous generation spent so much emphasis on work and building the economy and its success, perhaps at the sacrifice of relationship, both inside and outside the family. I wonder if it's led to these sort of problems.
Yeah, that's also, clearly, I hate to give one answer because there is clearly no single answer to that. I mean, but here the economy, right, that shift to a more neoliberal economic structure, I think that happened in the mid-90s, right? That lifetime employment and sacrificing everything family for the sake of the company, this corporate marriage. They had their own pros and cons, but that's not given, right, to a younger generation. Then that would really also impact on, people's sense of, whether how secure or safe they might feel. And for better or worse, one could argue Japan is definitely a so-called lonely society. It's heading to that direction. And it may be unique in some way, but you could say it's to some extent impacts of the neoliberal values, which society values people that are based on productivity, meaning I call it instrumental values. So if you are living in a society that is sending a signal, right? Like, well, your worth, your self-worth is depending on your productivity. That is like how you end up internalizing this kind of instrumental values to judge yourself. But you do the same towards other people. You also judge other people by applying these instrumental values. And then if that's how you interact with each other, clearly, that is leading to the lonely society, because we all know we get sick, we age. So one day we become not the so-called productive member of society. So, yeah.
Yes, I mean, loneliness is a problem here in Australia. And as you mentioned, obviously it's recognised as a big problem in the UK, and clearly it's a problem in the US as well. I think from your research, clearly, when we're young, we're wanting to feel needed. And then maybe when we do have the structure of family, we are needed, so we don't think about it. I'm sure when my son, who's 17, maybe in a few years when he leaves the house and he doesn't need me, maybe other than for money,
Mm-hmm.
I will think, oh, I'm not needed by him as much as I once was. I might struggle with that. So could the short answer to finding one's ikigai be meaningful relationship, if that's one takeaway?
It is certainly one takeaway, I would say. Yeah. I think if you were to think what's most important in life, again, if you're already embedded in a very good relationship, you might even say, right, well, why so focus on ikigai? It's okay to have or not. But certainly, it seems almost right when people are not, well, languishing again, right, comes back here, right? If people are languishing, people really latch onto ikigai, but it becomes like a little bit of the abstract concept, such as that may be something like lofty, but I don't have it yet. But once I have it, all the meanings would be restored in my life, and it would be okay. But then maybe what you need is actually having good relationship. It's almost like misplacing focus, that you think you should have something else to be happy, but maybe what is more important is having this kind of sound relationship that may be the foundation for happiness for many people. Because once you become very goal oriented all the time, it could be endless, right? Like more and more. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's going back to this idea that we could interpret ikigai to be the spectrum of things, and it's not the pursuit of one life goal. It can be this appreciation of small things, relationships. So in terms of goals, should we make our goals relational? Have goals related to the service of others?
I wouldn't say so. People would figure out. If I were told at the time when I was a high school student, that's what Ikigai ought to be. I was such a rebellious one.
I
I'll
see.
be, hell no. No. But probably that was also because I have such a good family. I never questioned that my parents might not love me or something, right? So I had this complete implicit secure attachment regarding myself. So that's why I was able to think about, no, I want something big. And then that's also was the phase I was going through. And then that probably prompted me to eject myself, whatever the way I left Japan and to study abroad for a while. And in the end, I ended up being an anthropologist. So my young times, goal-oriented Ikigai served me good. But now, if somebody were to ask me what my Ikigai is, I would definitely say something, it's like, I don't know, small thing is fine. Just if I can benefit other people, I think that's good. Basically, I don't want to harm people if possible. And I would like to just, benefit others. It could be just like, I had this cat that I loved and we had her for 15 years. So providing comfort, food, everything I could provide for this cat for a while. When she was ending her life in the last several years, it became very important for me. That could have been Ikigai at that time. And then now, because I just finished the book, it's almost like writing is also one way of benefiting people by sharing your insight with others, with the hope maybe some of the insights I gained from my research might help other people. Teaching is the same way. And when it comes to my parents, just calling my parents once a week, and I think that's a small thing I could do, but that's also important. So,
Well, thank you. I do usually ask the question at the end of the interview, what's your Ikigai? But your work's definitely benefited me. So thank you. And I will read your new book.
thank you.
And yeah, it's interesting how your Ikigai, it can be something like your cat or calling your family. That's these little important things. So maybe we should end with just some advice. If someone is feeling lonely, what advice do you have for them?
Yeah, well, actually, it's amazing you are ending our conversation with that question because that was something I was thinking about for a long time. And I included what I think might be helpful for people who are experiencing loneliness in the conclusion part of the book. So it's something I actually really came to think this way. So I think the first step is, it might sound very strange, but accept loneliness, meaning it's okay to be lonely. I say actually loneliness is everyone's business. It's not that, some people are lonely and other people are not. It is just the condition of what it means to be a human being and mammals. So we are like social animals. We need to belong. So that there's a biological foundation for what we are. But at the same time, in psychology, it's called the theory of mind. So the moment actually little ones start developing the sense of who they are, like development of the identity, selfhood, that happens through differentiating ourselves from others. So we have this need to distinguish ourselves from others. I am different from you and others, but at the same time, you need to belong. So it's actually a tug of war. So that's why actually loneliness is everyone's business. Yeah, so accept loneliness. If people are experiencing loneliness, I think the first step is say it's okay. Right now, it's tough,
Yes.
but it might get better. And everybody gets that. It's not mental illness. It's not pathological or something. We all experience loneliness. Right now, I'm going through that. So I think that would be the first step. And the second step is really accept other people and accept ourselves. Strangely, actually, when we are struggling, we tend to become more prone to be critical of others. There's a long explanation regarding why that's the case, but so meaning, just accept other people. It's okay, other people might be annoying, but they say, just think that's also okay. That's actually create more social affordance, meaning society that would accept marginalized people, deviation, right? Like, so others are okay, but I am okay. It's actually known that if you cannot accept who you are, you can accept others. So if you are critical of others, you're going to be very critical of yourself. So it kind of goes hand in hand. And finally, I would say find your ibasho. Ibasho, as I say, is a place one belongs to. We have relationship with people, but not only with people, we have a relationship with a place, with certain place. We don't know why, but we all have experience of connecting with certain place, right? More than others. So it could be even like to me, I'm from Kagoshima. Of course, when I think about that place in the Sakurajima mountain, I feel really connected. So right now I cannot travel, but even just this, have the image of Kagoshima really ground me. So if we have a favorite place to visit, that could be that Mallorca island in Spain has become actually our most recent favorite ibasho. So we often visit this small, beautiful island. So when I think about the place, I feel like, oh yes, in 2 years' time, maybe I can return to the island. Mm-hmm. So I think that could help because when you are like lonely to say, hey, find your ikigai, that's too difficult. It's not like something so realistic. But to think about where you like, think about your ibasho and find a way to connect with your ibasho. Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Ibasho was a word that I learned recently and I shared with my community, and it became extremely important to one lady in particular that she felt she could just be herself and she could say things. It was part of my coaching group, but she could share things that she really couldn't share with other people. And what you mentioned about accepting ourselves, I had a discussion with Ken Mogi about that. And it's one of his pillars of Ikigai. He says if we can release ourselves, which means to fully accept ourselves, life will just get better. And he said, you'll find that the most critical people are those that have not accepted themselves. And those that have accepted themselves, they're pleasant, they're kind, they're easygoing, they're fun to be around. And I'm wondering what you first mentioned about recognizing to be lonely is okay and it's the normal part of life. I recently learned a word called arugamama, related to Morita therapy. I found that fascinating, that if we can accept things, we no longer have that mental conflict where we're going, why does this happen to me? Or why am I lonely? Or this is not fair. But if we accept things, then it allows us to be present and we can reflect on things in a clear mind, or we can move forward. So would accepting loneliness be related to that concept of arugamama?
To some extent, accept the reality as it is, because being lonely is reality. I mean, to say I never experienced loneliness is more of the stretch, actually, I would say. I think we all have some experience of feeling lonely.
Yeah.
Probably many times. And when it is feeling acutely that way, it's just, that's okay. It's also part of reality. And why deny, why reject, why try to, struggle? It's it's okay. It would pass. Yeah. Yeah, I nearly studied Morita. I chose Naikan as a topic on my first research, but Naikan is also pretty similar, accept who you are, just the way you are. So, yeah.
I'd definitely love to have you back on and maybe talk about Naikan. So thank you so much for your time. And I really like that last piece of advice. Just, it's okay to feel lonely. And it might even give us the opportunity just to reflect on things. So I think that's really good advice. It's okay to be lonely sometimes. So thank you so much for your time and sharing all your research and insight, Chikako.
Thank you so much for interviewing me. So, thank you.
My pleasure, and I look forward to having you back on.
Happy to do. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Ikigai Podcast. To download Ikigai worksheets, to take the Ikigai questionnaire, or to join the Ikigai tribe, please visit ikigaitribe.com.